Now that we have finished our look at the Republic era of Rome, it's time to turn our attention to the early empire. The Roman Republic, for all intents and purposes, came to an end in 31 BC, when the young Octavian's navy met and defeated the senatorial navy of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. This left Octavian as the sole possessor of military power in the Republic. He then returned to Rome, and in 27 BC the Senate, properly cowed by his successes and influence, not only recognized him as the de facto leader of the state, but proclaimed him Augustus, the majestic one. After this period, Octavian take his uncle Julius Caesar's last name and use it as his first name, and will be known as Caesar Augustus. He will always refer to himself, however, as first citizen. Now, the Senate will continue to exist after this in an advise and consent role, mostly consent, but the vast Roman state will from this time onward be ruled by just a single man, the emperor. It will be during the early empire that the foundations for imperial rule will be defined, and some of Rome's most notorious emperors will take the purple, men like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. All of these men have interesting stories to tell, but I unfortunately don't have time to tell them, so in this lecture, I plan on focusing on only two of them, Caesar Augustus and the infamous Nero. First, though, I would like to set the stage for the demise of the Republic by taking a very brief look at the circumstances that led to its demise. And for that, I need to take a look at Julius Caesar, Octavian's uncle, whose eventual assassination at the hands of some disgruntled members of the Senate will, for all intents and purposes, bring the curtain down on the Republic. Julius Caesar was arguably Rome's greatest commander of the late Republican era. If you want, just a side note, if you want to pronounce his name correctly, it's not really Julius Caesar, but rather Julius Caesar. Latin doesn't have a soft C sound, and J is always pronounced as a Y. Nevertheless, I'm going to stick with Julius Caesar just because that's the common pronunciation that everybody recognizes. Now, one of the greatest ambitions of an upper-class male in Rome was to acquire dignitas, or status, during his lifetime. And one of the fastest roads to status, or dignitas, was military command and victory over Rome's enemies. So what Caesar will do is petition the Roman Senate for permission and authority to invade Gaul. Now, Gaul is Western Europe, the area that we today refer to as France, Switzerland, and Belgium. The Senate agreed to give him this command, and so in 58 BC, Caesar will take his legions and invade the West. For the next 8 years, he will rampage through the territories of the Gaulish tribes, defeating them one after another in succession. Now, the Gaulish tribes oftentimes outnumbered him in any particular battle. However, despite their ferocity and fanaticism almost in terms of battle prowess, the Roman legions always were able to overcome ultimately these tribes due to Rome's greater command structure and organization of the legions, in addition to the fact that Caesar was a brilliant tactician. Now, another indication of his brilliance was the fact that early on he decided that he would be able to propagandistically increase his dignitas by making the Roman public aware of what he was doing. And so throughout the campaign, he kept meticulous records of his victories and campaigns against the Gauls, and then periodically would send these communications back to Rome, have them read in the Forum in order to inform the Roman public as to his victories. This gained him, needless to say, a good deal of dignitas or status among the public, and made him very, very popular with Roman citizens. This popularity was so great, in fact, that the Senate began to worry about his growing power and popularity, and began fearing his ambitions and what he intended to do with this power that he was acquiring. At the same time in Rome, there was an older contemporary of Julius Caesar's, another great commander called Pompey the Great, because of his great victories that he had earlier obtained against Rome's enemies. Now Pompey began to grow jealous of Caesar's rise to fame and his acquiring of dignitas, perhaps at Pompey's expense to a certain degree, in the eyes of the public at least. And so he began to leverage the Senate's growing fears and suspicions of Julius in order to get them to eventually recall him from the campaigns in Gaul. Now, the Senate will eventually cave into Pompey's pressure and issue a recall to Caesar to return to Rome. Now, for the Senate to recall a commander from the field was tantamount to stripping him of his power. Partly because when a general returned to Italy with his legions, by law was not allowed to bring them into senatorial jurisdiction without permission of the Senate. So, of course, Caesar was not overly happy with this decision on the part of the Senate. Nevertheless, he agreed to return to Rome. However, he had an ulterior motive in mind, because he brought his legions with him. So he crossed the Alps, bringing his legions into northern Italy, and then at a place called the Rubicon, he made a very fateful decision. The Rubicon is a small stream in northern Italy that marked the boundaries between Julius Caesar's jurisdiction and the Senate's jurisdiction. It was demanded by law that Caesar leave his legions on the north side of this boundary. So Caesar made the decision to cross the Rubicon with one of his legions, with the famous statement that the die is cast. So he crosses the Rubicon with a single legion and then moves southward toward Rome. Now this caught the Senate off guard and completely by surprise. They certainly did not expect him to defy their orders in this manner. And so as he marched toward Rome, they were in a panic as to what to do. So they will appeal to Pompey to take control of their legions in order to take to the field and face this challenge to their power. And Pompey will do so. This immediately plunges the Republic into a disastrous civil war. Now the commanders will meet in several battles, eventually culminating in a battle at a place in southern Greece called Pharsalus, in which Pompey's armies are decisively defeated by Caesar. Now when Pompey realizes that his cause is lost, he will flee the field and will travel to Egypt in order to try to find a refuge at the court at Alexandria. Now, Egypt was still under the control of the Ptolemy dynasty at this time. In fact, it was the last Hellenistic kingdom to still remain free from Roman domination to this point. So Pompey expected to find a warm welcome there. Now he was welcomed at the court of Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII. However, as Julius Caesar closed in on Alexandria, the Greek commander of Ptolemy's forces took Pompey prisoner and executed him by decapitating him. When Julius arrived at Alexandria, he was presented with Pompey's pickled head in a jar. Now this did not please Julius Caesar. He considered it to be presumptuous of a Greek to pass judgment and execution upon a great Roman general, especially one as great and with as much dignitas as Pompey the Great possessed. So Caesar took the Greek commander prisoner and executed him. But with the death of Pompey, Caesar was left as a sole military power in the Republic at that time. Before returning to Rome began the period of Caesar's love affair with Cleopatra. He will return to Rome to great acclaim for his victories over his enemies and the cessation of the civil war, and the Senate will cave in to his demands, and not only will they make him consul. Consuls were one of two annually appointed leaders of the city of Rome. So not only will they make him consul, but eventually they will make him dictator for life. In Rome, the office of dictator was established in order to give an individual total power to be able to confront a crisis situation that might arise. By law, the dictator was only given this power for 6 months. However, Caesar kept pressuring the Senate to extend his dictatorial powers to the point where eventually the Senate simply caved in and appointed him dictator for life. Now, when Caesar had finally acquired this level of control and command within the state, he began to introduce a number of social reforms that made him even more popular with the public. Now, of course, Caesar had now acquired ultimate power within the state system, and the Senate began to grow very fearful of what his ultimate intentions were, thinking that his final intention was to make himself king of Rome, which every senator opposed vehemently. And so a certain group of senators formed a conspiracy to simply remove Caesar from the scene. Meanwhile, Caesar adopted his grandnephew, a young man of 19 years of age by the name of Octavian. He adopted him as his son since he had no natural male heir himself. This was in 45 BC. The Senate's suspicions continued to grow stronger and stronger until finally they made the decision to simply remove him from office altogether. So on the Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by this conspiratorial group of senators. They hoped that his assassination would solve whatever problem might arise. However, instead of that, it was the cause of another civil war which erupted between young Octavian and the senatorial forces. So Octavian took command of his uncle's veteran army in order to find and punish the guilty senators. The senators, meanwhile, gathered together their forces and appointed Mark Antony as general of their forces to oppose Octavian and Caesar's veteran army. This will lead ultimately to one of the major turning points in Roman history, that is the naval battle at Actium, in which Octavian's forces will defeat the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra, leaving Octavian as the sole undisputed leader of the Roman world. So when Octavian returns to Rome, victorious from his battle over Antony and Cleopatra, a cowed Senate will not only grant him consular powers, but also the same dictatorial powers for life that they had granted his uncle. In addition to that, they will eventually vote him the title of Augustus in 27 BC. Augustus meaning exalted or majestic. This is the title by which Octavian will be known throughout the rest of his life. He will take Julius Caesar's last name as his own first name, and then appended to that the title of Augustus, so he will be known as Caesar Augustus throughout the rest of his reign. However, interestingly enough, he himself would never really adopt that title, but will maintain the fiction that somehow he is not the supreme leader of the state after all, but just one of the citizens, just the first citizen. And so he will title himself as the first citizen, or in Latin, the civitas princeps, the first citizen of the republic, even though it is no longer a republic, but an empire being ruled by a single individual. Once he is firmly in control of the empire's destiny, he will expand the empire's border to include almost all the Mediterranean, in addition to the territories that Julius Caesar had added in Gaul, Switzerland, and Belgium. Over this territory, he will impose what we call the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. Basically, wherever the troops went, wherever the legions went, they brought control, pacified the territory, and enforced the peace. So this general peace is a peace that will last for about 200 years. Now, Octavian will continue to rule until the age of 74 when he dies at this advanced age. He will have ruled for 47 some years. And from the point of view of modern scholars, in hindsight, he ended up being one of the best rulers that the empire ever had. We see here an example of how Caesar Augustus used imperial portrait sculpture as a propaganda tool. You look at this rather handsome sculpture, you wonder, what's so propagandistic about it? In this particular case, if you take a look at how the hair is handled, you can see that it is somewhat unruly, uncombed, messed up. What is the intent of that? Well, it's to try to make an association with the great and legendary Alexander the Great, because this is the way that Alexander's hair was often styled, at least in his portraits. So what Caesar Augustus here is doing is making a deliberate link to that great and legendary figure from the past. It's interesting to note that many Roman emperors will adopt this hairstyle simply as a way to also link them with Alexander the Great. It's interesting how we oftentimes use hair as a way of making a statement about ourselves and the people that we admire. In addition, notice how youthful Caesar Augustus here looks. So what he is doing is breaking with Republican realism, like this gentleman here that we've seen before, and that the Romans were so skillful at being able to realize, in order to make himself look less grizzled, less elderly, less realistic. And this is typical of the way his portraits were throughout his reign, throughout his life. No matter how old he got, he always projected a certain sense of eternal youthfulness. What was propagandistic about that? Well, the idea was that in some way, he was, in the eyes of the people, portrayed as being somehow maybe more elevated, a little better than the rest of us, because he didn't seem to age. So it wasn't that he was saying that he was a god, but he did have, after all, divine heritage, supposedly, and perhaps we see a bit of that reflected here in this official portrait of his. So here we see arguably the finest figure sculpture from ancient Rome, any time of ancient Rome, quite frankly. It's called the Augustus of Prima Porta. Prima Porta is the place where this was excavated from the villa of Livia. Livia was Augustus's third and final wife, and after his death, she retired to this villa and apparently took this sculpture along with her. Many scholars consider this sculpture to be an example of perhaps not just the finest Roman work, but perhaps the work of a very skillful Greek sculptor, perhaps a slave in the service of the imperial family. And the reason they say that is because the figure is a little finer than what typically we see being produced from Roman studios. So unlike the portrait sculptures of the Republican era, where the Romans really excelled in that veristic, realistic kind of portrayal, they typically didn't handle their figure sculptures all that well. But this one is undeniably beautiful, and therefore perhaps was produced at the hand of a Greek sculptor. But regardless of whether it was or not, it's obvious that whoever created it was very much aware of the Doryphorus, or as they called it in Rome, the canon, because the pose is very similar in the somewhat idealized figure that we see here. So the suggestion is that whoever the sculptor was here certainly was aware of the Doryphorus. Remember, there were a lot of copies of this particular sculpture in Rome because they so much admired this manly physique. Also, there's this figure here, the Antikythera youth, that would seem, based upon the pose, to also have been an inspiration for the sculpture of Augustus. Again, the upraised arm, the contrapposto pose, the relaxed stance, and so on. So whether it was a Roman or a Greek sculptor, one would say that without doubt they were influenced by these Greek prototypes. In this particular pose, with the upraised arm, this is Augustus in his guise as Imperator. An Imperator is a commander. And so whenever you see a Roman figure sculpture with an upraised gesture in this manner, it represents him making a statement to his troops or to his people as commander general for the most part. Now this is an interesting combination of both idealization and realism in the handling of this sculpture. Obviously you can see the realism very plainly expressed in the breastplate and in the handling of the drapery. And also realism that we associate with the face as well. In other words, I think that the sculptures like this probably represent more or less closely the younger Caesar Augustus. In other words, I think that sculptures such as this do capture the look of Augustus, even though it may not be totally realistic. Let's take a look a little closer here. We can see that typical youthfulness that we see in the face, along with the tousled hair. And then you can see again the realism in the clothing, in the drapery, in the breastplate, and so on. But also the idealization in the physique itself. If we look at the base of it here, we can see here again that typical approach to a marble sculpture where the sculptor creates a support element next to the leg, like we saw in so many examples of Roman copies of Greek sculptures. And so if this had been done in bronze, and it's possible that there was an original one in bronze and that this is a copy, but we don't know that for certain. But nevertheless, if it had been in bronze, there would be no need for additional support. But once you create a sculpture like this in marble, then you need to have some support element here next to the leg in order to stabilize it. Because otherwise, the whole sculpture is supported by just these very small contact surfaces here on the foot. And that's not enough to be able to securely stabilize it. In this particular case, instead of the ubiquitous tree trunk that we oftentimes see next to a leg in other Roman copies, here we have a very interesting portrayal of a Cupid riding a dolphin. What's the significance of this combination of figures? Again, it's propagandistic. What's the dolphin and the Cupid relate to propagandistically? Well, the dolphin symbolizes Augustus's victory at Actium. So anyone seeing the sculpture is reminded of that great military victory of his. As far as the Cupid goes, what we see here is a reminder that the Julian family, of which Augustus was a part, was supposedly descended from Venus. So it reminds the public that we're looking here at an individual who has a divine ancestry. So as you look at this sculpture overall, it's quite a fine example of Roman figure work in the early imperial period. Now, as we know, marble sculptures were painted. And so this has enough pigment still attached to it in various grooves and other places that scholars today can discern what kind of colors would have been used here. And so here is a recreation of the way it may have looked. Now, in my opinion, this is a little egregious. The colors seem to be kind of clashing and don't integrate that well with each other. And I don't think it looks very good. But of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose, right? But here is another one. I wanted to show you this one as well. This is a portrait of the Emperor Domitian. And here's the way that scholars think it may have looked. A little too cartoony looking for my taste. But here we see a relief carving where I quite like the colors here. I think they go well together and help express the sense of the event of the moment. And then here is a freestanding sculpture of Athena. I think the color here works fairly well also. So back to a look at the Roman figure sculpture. Here we see one again of Caesar Augustus. It's again quite beautifully done, so maybe the product by the hand of a Greek sculptor again. Don't know for sure. But nevertheless, it's a nicely carved piece. This is a representation of Augustus in his role as Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus means the chief priest of Rome. Whenever you see a figure like this with a shawl over the figure's head, then that is representing the emperor in his role as the chief priest of Rome. So Pontifex Maximus. Maximus meaning large, and Pontifex having something to do with bridges. So chief bridge keeper of Rome, maybe in the sense that keeper of the bridges is concerned with the welfare of the people and the state. Now, you might recognize the term Pontifex Maximus because it's also used today as a title for the Pope in Rome, the Pontiff. Now, another thing that's interesting about this figure is that it is a combination statue. In other words, the figure, and this is fairly common practice among Roman sculptors, the figure is created separately from the head. So when the body is created, the area where the neck is inserted is left empty, so that the head can be created separately and then inserted into that cavity. So if you look at this up close, you can see very clearly the seam where the two pieces come together. This was a fairly common practice among Roman sculptors when it came to figures, and sometimes you'll see them using two different kinds of marble. In this case, the two types, there are actually two different qualities of marble here, but it's hard to discern one from the other. They look pretty close to one another. But the thing is, another thing that's interesting about this is, again, we see that the eternal youthfulness being represented in Caesar Augustus, that is so typical of his portraits, keeping in mind that this was created in 12 BC, meaning that he would have been around 50 years of age at this time, and certainly not as youthful looking as this. This is an example of propaganda type artwork because most people in the empire, even in the city of Rome, would probably never have seen Caesar Augustus in person. So as he aged, he wanted people to think of him as being eternally youthful. And so then this is the kind of image or persona that he wanted to have projected of himself throughout the empire. So here we see one where the combination doesn't work quite as well, simply because the head is of an older man, whereas the body is of an idealized figure, almost of a godlike form. So we have this realistic head with the idealized body that it doesn't really work together that well, in my opinion, so it's a little bit weird. Here, though, we see one where I think it's an interesting combination of white marble with a colored marble, or colored stone at least. And this kind of approach was fairly popular at one point in Roman history. Here we see again a female where the same technique is used with a plain marble head with colored drapery. The last thing I want to talk about here relative to Caesar Augustus is his tomb. So when he died, he was buried in a circular tomb right on the banks of the Tiber River. So see the curve of the bend of the river here in the foreground. And his tomb, as you can clearly see, was a circular tomb, this drum-like shape, in the center of which would have been his actual sarcophagus. This type of structure, of course, is called a tholos. And so it is very likely that the Romans borrowed this from their northern neighbors, the Etruscans. Now here's a model of the way it would have looked, more than likely. So that circular drum would have been covered over with dirt and then some trees planted on it. And then in the middle of that is a small shrine rising up in the center. So this is probably based upon Etruscan tumuli, like we saw in our lecture on the Etruscans. The thing that I find interesting about this, and I think it has historical value, art historical value, is the fact that this type of tomb, a circular tomb in other words, becomes associated in the minds of the Roman people with royal tombs or imperial tombs. Here's another example, a model of the tomb of Hadrian, you see looking somewhat similar. And then in a later period, here's the tomb of the Emperor Diocletian. It's octagonal, nevertheless circular in concept. The thing that I find interesting is that this becomes so entrenched in the Roman people's minds with a royal tomb or an imperial tomb that when the Christians will come along eventually and take over the empire, they will borrow this type of a shape as a tomb that's appropriate for the burial of their royal dead. Who would be the royal dead for a Christian? Well, saints and martyrs. So we see when the Christians come along, they will adopt this tomb form as commemoration for their royal dead. Now, one of the things that I wanted to address here, we've talked about before the benefits of Roman civilization. So wherever the Roman legions went, of course, they slaughtered people, they enslaved people, they dominated the neighbors of Rome. But once that process was finished, then they imposed peace and order upon those territories and brought a certain degree of benefit of Roman civilization that was imposed on those areas as well, for the benefit of the population, whether Roman or native. So we've looked at some of these before. Here's a list that I have compiled of the different benefits that Rome brought to the territories that it occupied. Now we've looked at some of these already, so I'm not going to spend time on those, but I do want to touch on some of the others. Let's take a look first at cities built or improved. Now we've already talked about cities, so I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. But I just want to make the point that these cities, that especially the ones that were newly established, were made primarily as a reward for a veteran lifetime of service in the legions. So veterans would be given a plot of land and settled in one of the provinces. Cities would be built in order to accommodate them, and they would settle down there for the rest of their lives. Now the advantage, of course, to the veteran is that he's got a plot of land and he's got a home, he's got a place to live. The advantage to the state or to the empire is the fact that you've got communities of veterans settled in far-flung parts of the provinces, and their very presence will help to keep peace in those provinces, and they will always be available or on call, basically, if ever trouble arose. So it benefited both the veterans and the state to settle veterans in colonies such as these. So here we see at Sabratha, a city that was built to settle veterans. Now, these cities are built throughout the empire, and of course, you need to link them together with a network that would provide easy access and trade routes. So the Romans developed a very sophisticated system of roads. So let's take a look here at some roads from the empire, keeping in mind that this was one of those benefits of Roman civilization that was much lamented after the civilization collapsed. So here are some examples. We've got the one on the left is from Italy, one in the center is from Spain, and the one on the right is from the Middle East, I think Syria or someplace like that. Now you can see that they're badly weathered, of course, after 2,000 years of being exposed to the weather, but nevertheless still in fairly good condition. Bear in mind that the Roman roads were one of the benefits of Roman civilization that were lost after the fall of the empire. So during the Middle Ages, these roads fell into disuse, oftentimes overgrown and completely lost from memory. But as you can see, very well built, obviously, because they're still extant today, and so a testament to Roman engineering. So it is estimated by scholars today that some 50,000 miles of paved roads that were patrolled by the legions for safety built a grid throughout the empire, linking cities in all parts of the empire. And of course, these were built for the legions in order to be able to move legions quickly from one trouble zone to another of the empire. But of course, the very presence made the travel across Europe faster and safer than at virtually any other time prior to the 19th century. Here we see a diagram of how these roads were made. So once the engineers had surveyed the course and made them as straight as possible, cutting their way through impediments such as cliff sides or even burrowing through mountains with tunnels or filling in swamps to make it possible to create these roads, then what they would do is to, as we see in this diagram, is to dig a deep pit, the bottom of which would be filled with large base stones. This is just rubble put into the bottom of the pit. Then above that would be a layer of clay mixed with stone. And above that, layer of smaller broken pieces of stone laid down. And then above that, gravel. And that gravel would be smoothed out with a slight camber, meaning a slight rise in the center so that the water would drain off of it during rainstorms or after rainstorms. And then on top of the gravel would be laid some well-cut and fitted flagstones. And then on either side of the roadway you would have curbing as well. So paving stones and curbing on the sides would make a very fine and well-defined road. Now these roads crisscrossing over the empire, of course, tying the cities together and the different provinces together, providing for fast travel and safe travel by merchants and travelers. Every so often the road would come to an obstacle such as a canyon or a river valley. And across these areas we had to have bridges that would be constructed. So here are some examples of Roman bridges. Obviously, engineers making prime use of arcuation, along with, in some cases, concrete, along with ashlar masonry, all combined together to be able to create these very durable and useful, practical engineering works that were necessary for uninterrupted travel on the roads throughout the empire. Now, these are so well constructed that some of them are still in use today even by automobile traffic. Beautifully designed and engineered. Now we're going to take a look briefly here. We'll come back to aqueducts in just a moment, but I wanted to take a look at this altar that was created at the command of Caesar Augustus in order to celebrate the Pax Romana. So the Ara Pacis, meaning the altar of peace, built in 10 BC. Here's the way that it looks in my little model to give you an idea that the altar is actually inside, and this is a hypaethral design, in other words, open to the sky. Now this was raised in honor of the Roman peace, and so it's celebrating the Pax Romana, but also a very interesting aspect of it is as you look around the upper panels here, you can see the outside is covered with relief carving, but the panels on the upper portion are particularly interesting, as you can see here, because it's the first time that public art is used to depict a specific event with recognizable figures. So these figures are actually people that lived in Rome at the time that this altar was dedicated and came here to the dedication and are represented as being present. Now another interesting feature of this is that Caesar Augustus commissioned this specifically as a way of promoting family life. He was concerned during his reign with a declining population, and so in this particular case, as a way of hoping to increase population, he represents entire families as coming to the dedication of this altar. So we see in it entire families, both men, women, and children of various ages, being represented here. A very interesting application, again, propagandistic art, right? And this is the way that it more than likely looked when it was dedicated. So again, fully painted like we have seen with sculptures and with other bits of architecture. So we're skipping public housing because we've already talked about that. But let's take a look at the water and aqueducts. So these cities, building these cities and the increasing population of the cities required a great deal of water, oftentimes more water than was available locally. And so Roman engineers and designers came up with very clever and ingenious solutions to this, and it's called the aqueduct. The aqueduct system is a water delivery system. And so in this particular case, we see one of the most famous ones called the Pont du Gard, which is located in southern France. Pont is a French word for bridge, and Gard is the name of the river, so the Pont du Gard. Now, usually when the public thinks of an aqueduct, this is the kind of structure that they're thinking of. However, keep in mind that this is just the elevated portion of an aqueduct, necessary in order to span the distance from one side of the gorge to the other side, so that the water will continue to flow uninterruptedly. But the aqueduct itself is actually a water system. It's not just these raised bridges, which in themselves were engineering marvels. And so what we have here is a system that consists primarily of a canal, where engineers would locate a distant water source of fresh water of sufficient volume to provide enough water to the urban area where it was going. And it had to be high enough that the path between it and the distant source was at an incline because the water ran by gravity. So it could continue to run 24/7 without constant supervision. The system was designed in order to deliver water supplies from those distant sources and basically consisted of a canal, similar to what we see here. That would be similar to what you could see on top of the Pont du Gard here. So a channel about 3 or 4 feet wide and maybe 3 or 4 feet high, depending upon the volume of water that it needed to carry. And then you see my model of the water flowing through the water channel on the top, and that would be what's up here. So this entire structure was designed with these beautiful arcuated series of arches as a way of simply getting that channel up to the proper level so that the water could flow from one bank to the other without interruption. Now, most of these channels, interestingly enough, were actually below ground, like you see here in this image. You get some idea of the scale of this particular aqueduct channel. Most of these were below ground, and the reason for that was the fact that it would prevent evaporation along the course of the route. It would keep the water clean and pure and free of debris and that sort of thing. And also in times of trouble, it might make the water supply source difficult to find by enemies that would want to cut your water. So these elevated aqueduct sections, the bridge work, would be needed in order to maintain the slope of the channel to maintain a constant water flow. So from the source to the destination, there was a slight incline the entire distance. So here's some examples of aqueducts that still exist today. None of these are in use any longer, but beautiful examples of Roman engineering and ingenuity. You see on the left, one of my favorite ones is a stretch of aqueduct, of elevated aqueduct, that's bringing water to the governor's palace in Segovia, Spain. On the right, you see one in southern France, and then the stubby one is located in Israel someplace. Now, I told you earlier on about the Gadara Aqueduct, and I just wanted to show you a little bit more detail about this aqueduct. Gadara was a city that was mentioned in the Gospel of St. Matthew, at which Christ performed one of his miracles. In that miracle, he exorcised demons from a couple of men and cast those demons into a herd of swine who immediately ran into the Sea of Galilee and drowned themselves. That begs the question, however, of how truthful that whole scenario was, because when you look at the Gadara, you can see it's some distance from the sea here, so that's quite a journey for the pigs to travel. But nevertheless, this is where Gadara was located. Now, at the time of the Roman era, this was a Roman city also. And so with the increase in population and so on, it needed additional water supplies. And so a source was discovered in Dil, which is in today's Syria, which is quite some distance from Gadara. Now, this project was first begun during the reign of the Emperor Domitian in 90 AD. The distance from Dil to Gadara, and this line shows you the track of the canal that was created, the distance is some 105 miles, which is an incredibly long span. I think the longest aqueduct up to that time was like 60 miles or so. It indicates 105 miles. Now, our look here from Google Earth doesn't show the difficulty of the terrain, but it was a very tortuous type of terrain, very difficult to try to cover. The distance here of 105 miles from the height of Dil to the elevation of Gadara required an incline, a very gentle incline of about 12 inches for every mile. And of course, that would be difficult to achieve with even today's modern surveying equipment. So keep in mind that in the days of ancient Rome, of course, they had very primitive kind of equipment that they would be using here. I referred to this back in my introduction as an example of Roman tenacity, and I think the fact that it took 120 years to complete this is evidence of that tenacity. This is an interesting diagram of the way that the underground portion, which was some 60 miles long, was created. And so it consisted of basically surveying the course, determining what the best course would be for the channel to be created, and then digging access tunnels every few hundred yards so that the workers could get down to the work site, and then debris could be carried out and air and light could be introduced into the tunnel sections. So 66 miles of this were underground, some of it being at least 262 feet below the surface, which is almost mind-boggling. This image on the right shows you a couple of men standing inside of one of the underground sections and gives you an idea of the difficulty that would have been necessary to create this, chipping this out from the solid bedrock. And then this image shows you, again, the fact that the important part of this design is that the floor of the channel had to be kept at that very precise incline. Boggles the mind, really, as to how the Roman engineers were able to determine the depth of and maintain that depth, that proper incline over the entire length of the canal, 105 miles. Another thing that you might be interested in is that there were 300 access shafts here, and the whole thing was dug by legionaries, not by slaves. And so some legionaries stationed in the Middle East are the ones that created this. And basically, they would enter into the construction site through the access shaft and then work in both directions at the same time, while simultaneously another group was working on another section, and they would meet up and join all the pieces together to arrive at Gadara. Now, unfortunately, when they did arrive at Gadara, the engineers apparently had made a few errors in their calculations, and so the aqueduct arrived actually 15 feet too low for an elevated reservoir that had already been built there. And so the aqueduct was never put to full use, but nevertheless remains as a testament to the tenacity and determination of Roman society in creating such an incredible engineering marvel.